Right, hello everybody, welcome to Sky Sports News. News just in, apparently Brighton chairman has sacked, I repeat, the Brighton chairman, news just in, has sacked Chris Hughton as manager of the Seagulls, despite getting promotion from the Championship last season. Obviously this is very, very surprising news. More about that when we get it. Don't go anywhere. Jim White, Sky Sports News.
Caught, not good enough. Pody, you forgot your bloody hat on.
Oh, for God's sake.
Gonna believe that.
So according to Sky Sports sources, the reasoning behind the sacking of Chris Hughton is actually, despite getting promotion from the Championship, he has an abysmal Premier League record and Brighton want to remain in the Premier League for the forthcoming season. According to our sources at Sky Bet, we're being told that apparently unknown 22-year-old manager Pony Tulis will be taking the job. Don't go anywhere, stay tuned. Sky Sports News will be with you ASAP as soon as we hear more about the Brighton Hove Albion situation. Don't go anywhere. Alright then, hello everyone and welcome to episode 2 of the Playing Like Pulis series in FM18, where we are of course going to be trying to recreate the Tony Pulis way once again with a newly promoted side, but not Stoke City this time. It's going to be Brighton. We are of course Pony Tulis. I do of course have Tony Pulis's lucky cap on, and to be honest, I said in the last episode that I was going to carry on wearing this cap. But I think if I'm going to keep on recording wearing this cap, it's going to drive me absolutely bonkers throughout the entire series. So we might see the cap return sometime in the future for whatever strange reason. But yeah, I'm not wearing the cap anymore. So okay, so what's this episode going to be about? We're going to take a look at our tactical approach. We're going to build it up from scratch. And when I build it up from scratch, I'm going to kind of try and discuss what's going through my head when I'm building it up from scratch. And yeah, the plan at the moment is to have a home tactic and an away tactic. I always find that's a good approach with new football managers. Last year in FM17, I used to play a little bit more attacking away from home when we were a better side, and a little bit more defensive when we were kind of a bottom half side, which is obviously naturally what you'd expect. Obviously, the reason why we used to go more attacking when I was a top 5, top 6 side was because teams would sit back anyways, right? So because you'd struggle, you'd have to basically go attacking against them to try and break them down. You'd sometimes have to take that risk away from home to try and score a goal. But when you're kind of like a relegation threatened side and you go in your first season, especially in our case in the Premier League, to someone's home ground, they're going to be attacking you a lot, which is why really it probably isn't the right idea to try and go out all guns a-blazing at their place either when you're a weak side. So you want to be a little bit more direct, a little bit more defensive. And that was, of course, exactly how Pulis used to set out his Stoke side. There used to be significant differences between how they used to play at home versus how they used to play away from home, as we would expect. Now, obviously, I've kind of discussed some of the reasons as to why I wanted to do this save. Reason number 1 was to please all the people that have been asking since FM17 for a Tony Pulis tactical remake, but there are also other reasons why I think doing this save this early on in the beta will teach us a lot about the match engine as well. And in terms of this direct 4-4-2 style of play, for me it's something that hasn't really worked well, maybe for FM16 and FM17. So when I kind of thought for the idea of this save, I was on a plane, and I kind of wrote down on my phone what I really wanted to test by doing this save in terms of the match engine and so on. So before we really kick off, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. So obviously, I think if you look back at FM17, and elements of FM16, especially after the Christmas update. It kind of seemed like if you wanted to succeed, you had to kind of play a possession, or if not a possession, but at least a short passing, short, narrow style of play. It's also why in FM17 we saw a lot of narrow formations do incredibly well. I'm looking at your 4-1-2-1-2s, your 4-3-1-2s, your 4-3-3s that we employed in our Blackburn save as well. One of the main reasons behind that as well was because the defensive positioning, especially on FM17 of wingers, was absolutely dreadful. Which was why, if you remember, in a lot of my tactical recreations, we used to have to tell wingers, anyone in an AMR or AML position, to man mark the opposition winger, to actually get them to track back and help out defensively. It didn't matter whether you had a player on support or attack out wide. I don't know what they did last year, but it was dreadful defensively from wingers. So playing a 4-4-2, playing the Tony Pulis way, it will, without a shadow of a doubt, give us a platform by which we can test whether or not this year that element of the match engine has been improved. I think as well, FM6, maybe not FM16, but FM17, if you had a target man on your side, regardless of the rest of your instructions, your players would just honestly try and hoof the ball up front blindly, like constantly. That's what I found, at least. I know a lot of people that found the same, and it almost felt like if you actually did want to play with a legitimate target man and utilize a strong, tall striker, it made more sense to play him either as a deep lying forward and try and hoof to him, specifically like from set pieces or your goal kicks and whatnot, or to play with a complete forward. And if you read the description of a complete forward, obviously he has to have target man traits. You're kind of thinking of like a Drogba type player, but can also do a lot more other stuff as well. So because the complete forward in the game and how the match engine interprets it is kind of target man-ish, you'd still end up with crosses being aimed more towards him, but it wasn't just as spammy as it used to be when you just set a target man. And that's why a lot of people no one used a target man, because using the role just broke the rest of your team. Other elements as well, direct football, like I said, I think if you look in recent years at most successful tactics, direct football just was very wasteful in the past two versions of FM, especially 17, where it just kind of seemed like, yeah, if you wanted a successful tactic, you had to play short passing, retain possession, blah, 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 blah. It almost seemed like a control mentality. Kind of sad, but I feel like FM17 and 16 were both quite one-dimensional in terms of what would succeed and what wouldn't. If you go back a few years' time, it was more than possible to create both styles of tactics with the right players, and direct passing worked incredibly well as well. So hopefully, if we can achieve success, if we can't, then it'll give us a rough idea of what this year's match engine is capable of, or how friendly it is to playing a direct game. Because like I said, the past 2 years, especially FM17, I didn't really feel like we're very direct football friendly. So overpowered wingbacks obviously were an issue in FM17, especially FM16. Probably more so in FM16, where as long as you had wingbacks on attack, you were basically guaranteed like 3 goals from crosses a game. But people don't realize that FM17 wasn't much better either, because of the way that you constantly play through the middle and play with narrow formations, because wingers were basically ineffective defensively and ineffective out wide as well, unless you played with inside forwards and you had a very strong team to utilize those roles and positions. The narrow play, and we did it in our Blackburn save last season with attacking fullbacks. They'd cross the ball into the box, and the success rate of grabbing a goal from a ball in the box from out wide from fullbacks was ridiculously through the roof. Now, I don't really mind that because it was ironed out from FM16, so it wasn't as overpowered. What frustrated me was that you could never get wingers to do the same thing. So wingers, even if they had a higher crossing attribute, would never just run to the byline and play it simple and just whip the ball into the box, and you wouldn't get as high of a success rate, which is why people ended up going with narrow strikerless formations. Yeah, so that's the idea really. I do really feel like this Tony Pulis approach will help us see not only whether or not this year's match engine actually welcomes this style of play, whether we can achieve success with that style of play. Another issue in previous versions of Football Manager has been set pieces. Now, for me, corners have been a little bit lackluster in the past iteration of the game. Thing is, if you go back a season or two, corners were far too overpowered. The near post corner glitch was in the game for so long that the game wasn't even fun anymore, and you'd end up with people posting tactics on places like FM Base, where the tactics would be incredibly successful and guarantee a success, but then your centre-back, like John Terry, would end up with about 30 goals a season. So it's like, is it really the tactic that's great, or are you just using a corner exploit? So I think it's going to be really interesting, because obviously Stoke relied so much under Pulis on corners, set pieces and throw-ins. I think it's going to be really interesting to see whether or not FM18 is a little bit more set piece friendly, because I feel like FM17 kind of wasn't. Except at the start of FM17, where you'd play a corner out to the guy on the edge of the box and he'd just blast it in almost every single time, because the AI would never man-mark that guy and he was just always left out in the open with a free shot and goal. And obviously we had the offside bug as well, where you'd sometimes get that scenario and then there'd be a player on the line who would just get a touch on the ball and he'd be offside, and it would be the most frustrating thing ever. But yeah, so I feel like the Pulis approach will help us also see whether or not them set-piece problems have been ironed out. Another problem in FM17, which was something I was quite vocal about, was that it was very, very difficult to get strikers to actually do any defensive work whatsoever unless you played them as like AMCs, as strikerless formations, right? Like in our gegenpressing 4-3-3 approach, we had to go with 3 attacking midfielders. And for me, in modern day football, strikers do track back. You know, the movement we used to get from playing a striker as an AMC was basically the movement we see from modern day strikers, yet the match engine would never seem to allow that. So it's going to be very interesting as well, because you think about Stoke, they're 2 players up front, especially the second one on the left, which was like your Walters or your Ricardo Fuller. They did a lot of legwork. They used to sometimes away from home, it would look more like a 4-2-3-1, because he'd drop out and you'd leave the main target man up front on his own. So it's going to be very interesting to see whether or not the match engine has been improved from that side of things, whether or not actually playing with a defensive forward on defence, for example, will actually drop back, will actually close down from the front and so on, which wasn't really what we got last year. So this style of play will hopefully help us analyse and see whether or not that's something that has been fixed. Next up, 4-4-2 was very hard to succeed with in FM17, maybe not so much in FM16, but what I will say is, if you look at the 4-4-2s where we had success in FM16 and FM17, most of them were strikerless, or played with 2 false nines. It just seemed like the match engine was not very friendly to a 4-4-2. It almost seemed like you'd always get outnumbered in midfield. You'd probably been spammed a lot by your assistant constantly telling you got outnumbered in your midfield. My Blackburn save, we had a lot of success with a 4-4-2, but it was a success with a 4-4-2 where we relied on width coming from the wing backs, and our wide players were wide playmakers, so they'd cut inside, which isn't really a traditional 4-4-2. It's more of a Pellegrini 4-4-2 with interiores, and for me that was how you would achieve success with a 4-4-2 in FM17. Not a traditional 4-4-2, because wingers were utterly useless. So obviously, again, so much reliance on width, so much reliance on wingers banging balls into the box, that I feel like this save will give us some solid ground to test all that out. Okay then, so as you can probably tell by now, this is going to be a bit of a long video, but you know, given the discussion we've just had and the fact that we're now going to build 2 tactics from scratch, yeah, it was always going to be a long video. So without further ado, let's jump straight in. So we're going to kick things off with what will be our home formation. Now, if you think about modern day Pulis at West Brom, for example, and towards the end of his reign at Stoke, he currently employs a 4-2-3-1 at West Brom, and he employed kind of a 4-3-3 at Stoke towards the end, which was really more of a 4-1-4-1. But we're going to go with the more traditional 4-4-2 approach for this season. It was kind of the approach that Pulis was mostly famous for, the approach that Stoke played mostly under his reign, and yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see if we can get success with a 4-4-2, playing the style of play that we want to. So let's begin. Create new tactic. Obviously, the formation we're going to set it to is a 4-4-2. And this is going to be quite interesting. I've never actually done a live tactical recreation thing here, unless you've watched my stream before. So just FYI for anyone watching, I assume you'll be watching. I don't know why I said that. Obviously, this is a work in progress. So all I'm basically carving out right now is 2 skeletons. It's going to be what we'll play with in pre-season. and what we'll probably start the Premier League with playing, and we'll tweak as we go along. So mentality-wise, I always find that when you're creating a tactic, it's always good to just start off on a standard mentality. Simply because, for me, a standard mentality for a 4-3-3 with a defensive midfielder, or a 4-2-3-1 with two defensive midfielders, or a 3-4-3 or a 3-5-2 can mean completely different things. Mentality is about finding the right balance, not just for the style of play you want to achieve. So, for example, a attacking mentality when you're playing a 4-1-4-1 is obviously very different to an attacking mentality playing a 4-4-2, and how it affects players' positions off the ball and so on. So hopefully that's pretty obvious. Away from home, we've probably dropped down to a counter mentality, but again, this is just a skeleton, so we're going to go with the standard mentality, and depending on how our players react once we actually watch ourselves playing, we might make changes to the mentality. In terms of the team shape, obviously, a lot of people might argue that if you think about Tony Pulis' sides, he'd probably have a slightly more structured team shape. But again, I think personally for now, we're going to stick with flexible, because for me, the way Football Manager describes structured is basically saying the defenders will defend, the midfielders will midfield, and the strikers will strike. And a lot of people, when they think about a fluid style of play, they think about, nice one-touch passing and so on. That isn't actually what it means. What it actually means is, if you're fluid, in fact, it explains it here. Players are expected to contribute to more phases of play than with the flexible philosophy. So for me, I'd say flexible is probably just about right for a Pulis style approach, at least at home, because that allows us to find the right balance where our players, as in our strikers and wingers, will contribute to more phases of play in terms of their defensive contribution, rather than just have a broad defensive unit where it's only the back four that really care about defending and the wingers won't really track back. It's early days. Again, the way that team shape might work in comparison to FM17 might be completely different this year. It honestly is all about how you find the match engine responds to your instructions. And that's why, we struggle every year. It takes time to get used to the new match engine every year. So for that reason, we're going to play it safe. I'm going to stick with flexible for now. Now, in terms of our team instructions, I think it's pretty obvious what we're really going to choose here. Again, when I'm building kind of a tactic from scratch, I try to keep it relatively simple. And then based on how your players react in game, you would then try and add more instructions or remove certain instructions and tweak it based on what you're seeing. At the moment, all we're doing is really theorizing. So I think it's pretty obvious that we are going to go for a higher tempo, and passing directness is going to be more direct. Now, some people may argue that Pulis was probably a bit more gung-ho, a bit more route one. I beg to differ. I think at home, at times, you don't want to be full-on gung-ho and give the ball to your opposition. Away from home, it wouldn't surprise me if we ended up just playing with a slightly higher tempo and actually did go route one, because we're going to see less of the ball anyways, so it's important that we are more direct with our passing with the two up front away from home, and that our tempo is higher, which means the rest of our players will react to the long ball going forwards a bit more and be more prepared to push forwards. In terms of our width, again, you think about Tony Pulis defensively, quite narrow, but I find that in a team like in a league, like the Premier League, you don't want to go too narrow. Unless it's FM17, and being narrow is incredibly overpowered. So for that reason, we're going to start things off being fairly narrow. Away from home, we could get even narrower, but I find fairly narrow is a good balance. When you go too narrow, I find that teams, especially ones that play with wingers or inside forwards or 4-2-3-1s, end up having way too much space out wide in the wide areas. And that then leaves you actually more vulnerable defensively than what you'd probably expect, being very narrow and concise and hard to break down. It doesn't work like that a lot of the time. Next up is going to be our build-up. So obviously we're going to be looking to pass into space. That's a bit of a no-brainer. When you play direct football, when you're so reliant on the pace that Pulis was, down the wings and up front, especially when you're going to be counter-attacking teams are going to be playing a high line against us, we have to take the gamble and try and pass into space, especially because most of our plays are going to be via counter attacks. So it's obvious you want to pass into space, try and get the ball further into the final third, and rely on the physicality that your players possess to be able to catch up with that ball. In terms of our build-up, we can argue it might be a good idea to go pump ball into the box, But I want to see first how the game this year reacts to having a single target man up front. The target man up front is already going to generate long balls forward automatically, so maybe selecting punt ball into the box would end up with far too many long balls going forward, to the point where your players or the match engine is incredibly wasteful. In terms of exploiting both flanks, most of our attacks are going to be coming, or counter-attacks rather, are going to be coming through the flanks, utilising the pace on our wingers, of course. Or, for example, direct ball forwards, target man, two big strikers up front, head the ball to the side, to a winger, into the space of the winger, he hits a ball into the box, and then you've got centre mids and whatnot getting in the box. The Pulis style of play, basically. So that should be pretty self-explanatory why we want to do that. Now, in terms of our defence, now a lot of people could argue for a slightly deeper defensive line. I'm going to stick to normal for now. Again, new match engine, home tactic. Let's not overcomplicate things yet. What we will try and do is use the offside trap. Probably thinking about a good old-fashioned Pulis side. They probably wouldn't put that much emphasis on trying to use the offside trap. For me, I'm going to try and use the offside trap at home, simply because historically in Football Manager, not using the offside trap has never really been a good idea. So that's what my gut feeling says about it. And as I've always said before, sometimes you have to satisfy the match engine and do certain things against what you're trying to recreate to actually achieve success. So I'm going to do that for now. We could take it off away from home, for example. We could end up taking it off going forwards. I don't know. It's all about trying to create as close a skeleton as possible. I'd say use offside trap is probably the only thing which is a bit iffy. In terms of closing down, we're actually going to look to close down a lot less. And as you can see, the defensive line actually went back a little bit, and that's one of the reasons why I went for a normal defensive line, because for me then the slightly deeper also becomes a little bit too deep. If you look at Pulis's sides, what they used to do is you'd get two banks of four in the two strikers. They'd get very, very narrow off the ball. They wouldn't actually start closing opposition players down until they were actually getting close to the box. By closing down less, we end up having two banks of four and two strikers in front of the opposition. Now, Pulis's sides, for me, never really used to really get too vigorous in terms of closing down until they reached a stage where the opposition was actually getting close to their final third, and that'll be something we try and implement in individual player instructions, where the back four specifically will be told to close down a little bit more, which will, instigate that pressing in the final third. But generally speaking, when they'd lose the ball, they try and get a lot of men behind the ball, be difficult to break down, and that's the thing. Closing down in terms of counter-attacking play, a gegenpressing style of play, for example, can be very effective. But when you're a team like Brighton or when you're a team like Stoke, it makes more sense to conserve your energy, be difficult to break down, force your opposition into getting frustrated and shooting from distance, or relying on having loads of men behind the ball so you can win it back and pounce, than actually playing a different counter-attacking style of play, which is the gegenpressing counter-attacking style of play. So that was a mentality that Pulis obviously had with Stoke. Next up, we're also going to use tighter marking. I always find that in Football Manager, using tighter marking is a good shout. It's very Pulis-esque, if you ask me. And I think that is going to be it for team instructions. Like I said, I don't want to overdo things. In terms of the attack, I'm not going to tell them any specific instructions just yet. So what I want to try and see is basically, like I said, we need to play our preseason games. We need to see how the tactic plays out. And if we feel like we're not getting stuck in enough, we're not winning the ball back enough, we're not creating enough counter-attacking opportunities, then we can, for example, select it. And we got to be careful not to get too many yellow cards as well, obviously. So we'll just have to wait and see how the match engine this year responds to that. Okay, now it's probably about time we choose player roles. So we'll start from the front. For me, the first player is going to be a defensive forward on defend. Think Jonathan Walters. Think Ricardo Fuller. This player is going to be expected to do a lot of closing down from the front, a lot of leg work. Make sure he's behind the ball when possible, but also as a defensive forward, he's a forward. He's that second striker that we really need. So for me, that role is pretty self-explanatory. Next role is probably your Peter Crouch. In our case, it will be our Glenn Murray. It's your Sidibe. It's your Ricardo Fuller, probably. The slightly more direct, larger striker. And again, he's not going to be on attack, he's going to be on support because, again, I want to try and see how much legwork off the ball we can actually get from a target man, from our second striker. Ideally, we will want him to still contribute off the ball. I feel like putting him on attack could isolate him, which isn't really what we want, nor really what we used to see from a Pulis side. And for that reason, in terms of these individual player instructions, like I said, I want them to do as much defensive work as possible as strikers up front. So for that reason, we're going to tell him to close down more and him to close down much more. The reason why I've not told the target man to close down much more just yet, again, I need to see how it plays out. I'm kind of worried that because the target man is going to be our outlet for counter-attacking, we don't want him to go a little bit too crazy in terms of closing down much more. Now, in FM17, you could have two strikers and tell both of them to close down much more, and they still wouldn't do any closing down. So again, this is something we need to test, and by doing close down more, hopefully it means that we'll get defensive work rate out of him, but simultaneously, he won't be trying to close down so much to the point where he wears himself out, and when we do have a chance to counter-attack, he's like, I don't know, on the other side of the pitch, like closing a fullback down, where really in that kind of scenario we need him in the middle of the park to be able to win the ball and head it down to one of the wingers so we can pounce forward. So that's going to be what we're going to go with for our two starting strikers. I think if you're familiar with how Pulis played, those two should be pretty self-explanatory. Next up, we've obviously got two very, very key elements to how we are going to counter-attack, and it's going to be my wingers. Now, wingers on attack, if you think about Pulis over the years, you know, when you get players like Rory Delap on the right-hand side, a lot of the time you'd end up with, like, Delap on the right-hand side, Etherington on the left. Etherington was really more of a traditional winger, whilst Rory Delap was kind of more of a wide midfielder. Now, for me, Football Manager, over the years, there never really has been that much of a difference between the roles, except when they introduced a wide playmaker. The reason why I've gone with two wingers on attack duties because I feel that's really what suits Brighton's players at the moment. I don't really feel like they've got a Rory Delap style of player who we could play as our wide midfielder on the right-hand side. But generally speaking, in terms of how we'll actually be playing football, I don't really think that just having a winger instead of a wide midfielder on the right-hand side is really going to hinder us trying to play the Pulis way. The reason why they're both on attack is to find that right balance. Now, a lot of people will be like, oh, you probably want to put them on support to make sure they track back. But this is what I mean. I need to test. For me, when I've got an MR and an ML, even on attacking, for me, they should still get into their shape in front of the fullback defensively. Like a winger attacking in ML is very different to a winger on attack in AML for me in terms of mentality and football strategy. So it's about seeing how in FM18 wingers now react to these types of instructions. And for that reason, because wingers are still a very vague area, because of how poor they were in FM17, I'm not actually going to choose any specific instructions. So yeah, we're going to go with two wingers on each side. If we feel like that's too attacking, we can always drop down to support. Chances are away from home, we're probably going to have them on support anyways. Next up, we're going to have our defensive midfielders. And like I said, it's all about balance. So one of the main reasons why I went for an attacking mentality on the two wide players is actually to make up as well for the fact that both of our strikers are on quite negative mentalities themselves. One being on defend, one being on support as well. And we need a little bit more forward thinking from somewhere. And given how we want to play, it makes sense that our players in the wide areas, the ones that are going to turn defence into attack, the ones that are going to be whipping the balls into the box, are the ones with that slightly more forward thinking mentality. Hence why they're going to be attacking. But to also find that right balance defensively, I'm actually going to opt to go for two defensive midfielders. Now, like I said, in previous versions of Football Manager, when I created Tony Pulis' Hoof and Hope, which was a pretty popular tactic a few years ago, which was a recreation of Pulis' way of play, we actually went with two central midfielders. Now, I'm going to start things off by going with two defensive midfielders, simply because that's what my gut feeling tells me to do at the moment. And it's probably me being slightly paranoid that a flat 4-4-2 has never really worked in Football Manager for the past 2 or 3 years in terms of a traditional 4-4-2 like what we're trying to recreate here with the more direct approach. So we are going to go with two deep-lying playmakers. We're going to go with two deep-lying playmakers on support. Now, in past versions of FM, I found it to be pretty good. I'm trying to think about, your Nzonzis and your Glenn Whelans and your Charlie Adams. Now, whether it's Nzonzi or Charlie Adam, for example, both very good defensively in terms of, sitting in front of the back four and doing dirty work. I mean, you can argue actually about Charlie Adam. Let's say Glenn Whelan, for example, or even Delap when he moved into the middle of the park late on. Or, I don't know, Dean Whitehead, for example. Good players defensively, but also not too shabby on the ball. And Zonzi, obviously, I'm a Blackburn fan. Good defensively, good on the ball as well. And if you have a slightly more creative player next to him as well, I feel like the deep line playmaker role in the defensive midfield position will get the best out of him. You might be wondering, why not ball-winning midfielder, for example? Well, ball-winning midfielder, you start closing down all over the place. Why not defensive midfielder? That would probably be a decent shout as well. But I just feel like going for two playmakers, when you choose a playmaker, the match engine historically, your players always try to pass the ball a little bit more to them because they are the playmaker. And the idea for me is if the defenders can try and prioritize passing the ball to these two, then they can play our wide men in. It's basically like a defensive midfielder. Being on support, they'll also move into midfield, which is what we want. So it won't really feel like two defensive midfielders, except when we're off the ball, which is exactly what we're trying to achieve. But at the same time, a traditional ball-winning midfielder or defensive midfielder might not take as many gambles in terms of playing the ball forwards, which isn't what we want. We want to take gambles going forwards in terms of playing direct balls forward. If we play a direct ball forward and it doesn't go out to the winger, at least we try to break. So for that reason, I'm going to go with two deep line playmakers. Maybe not the best of ideas. Might not give us the right balance having two playmakers in the middle of the park, but because they're defensive midfielders, because I'm not that fussed about their movement in terms of closing down, all I'm fussed about is having them basically glued to the two centre-backs so that we can create them two banks of four. So again, this is all theorising right now, and this could be chopped and changed quite significantly come the first few games of the Premier League season. But that's what we're going with for now. Just think Steven Nzonzi style of player. Good on the ball and good defensively. One thing we are going to do is we're going to tell both these players to tackle harder in midfield. Again, as you probably expect from a Pulis type side, but that's also why I didn't select Get Stuck In, because I kind of felt like I'm not really that fussed for my wingers to get stuck in. You know what I mean? I'm not really that fussed for certain other players, like my strikers, to get stuck in and give away silly fouls. I feel like when you don't select get stuck in and then you select tackle harder on specific players, that's almost like you're setting get stuck in on specific players. And then when you end up setting both because you have a certain player instruction or style in mind, get stuck in plus the tackle harder on a player just ends up resulting in yellow cards galore. So we're going to go with this for now. If we feel like we're not getting stuck in enough, then we can select the option because maybe it's been toned down in FM18. Next up, of course, we have our fullbacks. Now, they're going to stay on automatic simply because automatic just ends up inheriting the mentality. So as we chop and change from now until the first game of the season, standard means it's basically a fullback on support. I do kind of feel like the mentality is probably going to change a lot. And it will then allow me to see how the fullbacks react to that and get a rough idea what we really need to achieve. Now, if you think about traditional Tony Pulis style fullbacks, you're literally talking about centre-backs who can also play out wide as fullbacks, right? So you're talking about Wilkinson, Jeff Cameron. These are players who are kind of big, not your traditional small athletic fullbacks who are going to be looking to get forward and play balls into the box. And more than often what would happen under Pulis was that if one fullback went forward, the other would stay back. And that's one thing I find the automatic mentality does well when you have a standard mentality. Your fullbacks will try to get involved. Because your standard mentality is pretty conservative, when one goes forward, the other stays back, which, like I said, is what we're looking for. Now, in terms of fullback player instructions, he's been told to close down more. Like I said earlier, for me, because we're closing down less in terms of a team instruction, and we're playing with a normal, slightly deeper defensive line, we're going to get them two banks of four. So if you think about my fullback in this case, he's going to be pretty deep. When the opposition has the ball and my left back is in a kind of position where he can tackle the opposition, chances are the opposition winger is pretty damn close to our box. So that's kind of like the right moment where I want my players to then begin closing down, like Pulis sides do, as I explained earlier. We don't want them closing down too much in midfield. We want to be hard to break down. But then when it's time to really get ready to rumble, once the opposition have the ball in our final third, that's when I want the closing down to begin. And I feel like I can achieve that by telling my fullback to close down more and mark tighter and tackle harder. But because, like I said, of our defensive line and so on, you won't actually see him push or get too, or you shouldn't, too adventurous into midfield and close down like that. No, that would probably be achieved by choosing the level slightly higher, which isn't what we've gone for. I've also told him to aim crosses at target man. Now, I'm not really quite sure whether that's a good or bad idea. Again, we'll just try and experiment, but yeah, we'll see what happens with that. We'll get a rough idea whether or not our fullbacks will be getting a lot of assists or not. I'm not really expecting them to. For me, it should be the wingers getting most of our assists because our fullbacks are going to be very, very, very conservative. Next up, of course, we have our centre-backs. Now, back in the day, I used limited centre-backs, which is exactly what you'd expect from a Pulis side. No nonsense centre-backs. You get the ball, you hoof it forward, you get rid of it. But the thing is, that would actually work well given our current setup. We've got two very physical strikers up front. So chances are, even if your centre-backs aren't that good technically, they just hoof the ball forwards, you've got two warriors up front that are going to fight for it. So in terms of the instructions for these specific players, it's going to be exactly what I did for the fullbacks, bar the crossing to target man bit. I'd be very worried if my centre-back was out wide looking to cross a ball into Tom Ahmed. So closing down more, again, if the opposition, given how deep we're playing, are in a position where my centre-back can close down the ball, chances are the midfield hasn't done their job and the centre-back does need to pull his finger out and do something about it. Otherwise, he won't go venturing into midfield and whatnot, especially being a defend duty, not a stopper duty. And hard tackling, like I said. So I think that's going to be it in terms of what we go with so far. And actually, I just realised I forgot my goalkeeper. The only thing I'm actually going to tell my goalkeeper to do is distribute to my target man. In terms of our home side approach, in trying to recreate Tony Pulis's 4-4-2 that he came up from the Championship with Stoke, this is so far the home approach. It's what I'm going to be going with. So, yeah, let's save it. Now, as I said, we're also going to have a slightly different away from home approach where we're going to be a little bit more direct, try and focus a little bit more on being defensively resilient because teams are going to attack us, being a team that have just come up from the Championship, so it's about finding that right balance. Mentality-wise, I'm not changing mentality or team shape yet. I need to get a rough idea as to how the match engine works with them right now. Every year it differs a little bit, but one thing I am going to do is reduce my wingers on attack to become wide midfielders on attack, and you see that change straight away. The players drop a little bit deeper than they do as wingers, but we still keep that right balance in terms of they still will be ready to spring forwards if they need to. As long as I've got a left footer on the left and a right footer on the right and they have pace, which we hopefully will do with Anthony Kanaka and Solly March and some of the other wide players Brighton have, we should hopefully get a little bit more of a negative mentality coming out from them where they'll pay attention a little bit more to their defensive duties, which is what we want away from home, but also they will be ready to pounce with the attack mentality still. Next up, what we are also going to change, this is something I did in Football Manager 17 away from home when we played with a 4-4-2, especially up against the big teams, was actually utilise defensive fullbacks. Now, like I said, Pulis fullbacks kind of historically as centre-backs who can also play at right back and left back. And that's why they were so narrow as well. So it was hell trying to deal with long balls going forwards for opposition because you'd end up facing four centre-backs. And the defensive fullback in this case will just basically try and tell the fullback, look, dude, at home, we're more likely to score, and from time to time, one of you is allowed or has a license to roam and venture forward. Away from home, I don't want any of that nonsense. 4 defensive defenders, you get the ball, all you do is focus on defending. You get the ball, you play that ball forward, you hoof it forward to the big man up front. And talking about hoofing, that's why, like I said earlier on, we're going to change our passing directness to go route 1, and we're also going to increase our tempo to be much higher in that regards. Now, I'm not entirely sure about increasing the tempo. We'll have to wait and see what kind of effect that has. I do find that the much higher tempo is actually or was in FM17, not a very good idea because your players would end up rushing it too much and end up misplacing far too many passes. And given that we're Brighton coming into the Premier League, yeah, we're going to be misplacing a lot of passes already, right? But that's going to be it. That's all I'm going to do for our away change. That's going to be it for now. Obviously, both these tactics are massive works in progress. We'll probably end up seeing changes in roles in the middle of the park especially. Probably end up seeing a change in mentality or team shape going forwards. But like I said, I've not played any Football Manager 18 yet. And this was just me going through the process of trying to recreate Pulis's approach, both at home and away from home. Now, I wouldn't say I tried to recreate Pulis's approach away from home, even though you can argue defensive fullbacks is correct. It's just me being a Football Manager player for years, kind of knowing what I need to do away from home, try and strike that right balance. And hopefully you can see the logic to change the wingers into slightly more conservative wide midfielders and change the fullbacks to focus more on their defensive duties, where we'll look to park the bus a little bit more and go a little bit more direct. And obviously the reason why we want to go a little bit more direct as well is because teams at home are going to be attacking us. So when we've got two strikers up front, we see it all the time in real football, right, where teams like Arsenal and whatnot struggle to deal with two big men up front, for example, because they're just not used to it, with all the 4-2-3-1s nowadays and 4-3-3s. But that's going to be it. I'm actually going to save this as Pulis away. And that's going to be it, really. Obviously, this whole series is about trying to recreate this approach. We could, at the end of the series, look back at what we've begun with and compare that with what we finish with. But on that note, I think I'm going to call it a day for this video. It's been an incredibly long video. I didn't expect it to take this long, but it unfortunately has done. So next video, we'll probably take a look at what players we're going to fit into what roles, and probably take a look at trying to recreate some effective long throw and corner set pieces. Now, we don't really have a long thrower like Delap, but we can at least try and recreate the odd Pulis corner here and there. So until next time, I've been Kyanite. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Apologies it was so long, but deal with it. See you next time.